Zixathera stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the stars through the great viewing window. The ship was massive, larger than most human cities, and it carried the finest warriors of the Veltari hegemony. Zixathera had served the hegemony for 30 cycles, leading fleets to victory across 12 star systems. The Veltari way was simple. Study the enemy, find their weakness, strike with precision, and claim victory. Emotion was forbidden because it clouded judgment. Fear was weakness. Love was distraction. Only cold calculation mattered. The communication panel beeped softly. Commander Velron approached with data tablets in his forearms. His scaled face showed no expression, as was proper for a Veltari officer. "Strategic analysis complete," he said in their clicking language. "The humans appear primitive, but may serve as useful auxiliaries in our expansion." Zixathera took the tablets and studied the information. The humans had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Their ships were small and poorly armed, compared to Veltari vessels. Their military structure seemed chaotic, with too much individual freedom and not enough hierarchy. Most puzzling was their tendency to show emotion during combat operations. The recorded battles showed human soldiers, crying, laughing, shouting, and embracing each other. Such behavior made no strategic sense. "They are emotional creatures," Zixathera observed. "This makes them unpredictable but also vulnerable. We should be able to integrate them into our forces with minimal difficulty." A new alarm sounded across the bridge. The tactical display showed something that made even Zixathera's calm exterior crack slightly. Dark shapes were moving through space toward their position. The shapes were wrong somehow, too angular and sharp, like broken glass floating in the void. These were not ships in any conventional sense. They were constructs of the Devourers. Every spacefaring species knew about the Devourers, though few had encountered them directly. They were ancient machines that consumed entire star systems, turning planets into raw materials for more of their kind. They had been dormant for centuries, but something had awakened them. The constructs moved with purpose toward the Veltari fleet and the nearby human colony ships. "Signal General Quarters," Zixathera commanded. "Prepare for Defensive Formation 7. Contact the human vessels and inform them they should retreat to minimum safe distance." The response from the human ships surprised everyone on the bridge. Instead of retreating, the human vessels moved closer to the Veltari fleet. A communication came through on the standard diplomatic channel. The voice was rough and informal, nothing like proper military protocol. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Liberty Dawn. We're not running from these things. Our people are on those colony ships, and we're going to protect them. If you want to work together, we're listening. If not, stay out of our way." Zixathera stared at the communication display. The human ship was barely 1/10 the size of the Eternal Dominion. Its weapons were primitive energy cannons that would barely scratch a Devourer construct. Yet this Captain Morrison spoke as if his tiny vessel could somehow make a difference against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations. "Respond that we appreciate their courage, but recommend they follow standard evacuation procedures," Zixathera told the communications officer. Captain Morrison's reply came back immediately. "Courage has nothing to do with it. Those are our families down there. We don't abandon family." The first Devourer construct reached firing range. It was a massive thing, all sharp edges and dark metal, with weapons that could crack a moon in half. The Veltari fleet opened fire with their plasma cannons, following perfect tactical formations. Their shots were precise and coordinated, designed to disable the construct's power core with minimal waste of energy. But the humans did something completely unexpected. Their small ships scattered in all directions, firing wildly and seemingly at random. They ignored all tactical doctrine and flew their vessels in patterns that looked like pure chaos. One human pilot, a woman named Lisa Park, according to the communication logs, flew her fighter directly at a Devourer weapon array while screaming something about her daughter on one of the colony ships. "What are they doing?" Commander Velran demanded. "They're going to get themselves killed and accomplish nothing." Zixthara watched the tactical display with growing confusion. The human attack made no sense from a strategic perspective. They were wasting ammunition, exposing themselves to enemy fire, and coordinating their efforts through emotional outbursts rather than proper military channels. Yet somehow their chaotic assault was working. The Devourer construct was having trouble targeting the erratically moving human ships, and several of its weapon systems had been damaged by what appeared to be pure lucky shots. Then Lisa Park did something that made Zixthara question everything they knew about tactics. Her fighter was badly damaged and losing power. Any rational pilot would eject or attempt to withdraw for repairs. Instead, she aimed her crippled ship directly at the construct's main weapon array and activated her engines at full power. Her ship exploded against the Devourer's hull in a brilliant flash of light and debris. The explosion knocked out the construct's primary weapons and gave the Veltari fleet the opening they needed to destroy its power core. But Zixthara could not understand why the human pilot had sacrificed herself. The tactical gain was minimal, and losing an experienced pilot was strategically wasteful. Why did she do that? Zixthara asked aloud. Captain Morrison's voice came, over the communication channel again. His tone was different now, quieter and full of something that the Veltari had no word for. Because that weapon array was targeting the school ship. Lisa's daughter Kate is on that ship, along with 300 other kids. Lisa made sure those children get to grow up. More Devourer constructs were approaching. The battle was far from over, but something had changed in Zixthara's understanding. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources or glory. They were fighting for something else entirely, something that made them willing to die for people they might never see again. The Veltari fleet and the human ships found themselves working together out of necessity. The humans continued their chaotic attacks, while the Veltari provided covering fire with their superior weapons. It was messy and inefficient, but it was effective. When the last Devourer construct was destroyed, both fleets had taken significant damage. But the colony ships were safe. In the aftermath, Captain Morrison contacted the Eternal Dominion directly. "We need to talk," he said. "These Devourer things aren't going away, and neither of us can handle them alone. Maybe we can help each other." Zixthara looked at the tactical reports. The humans had lost 12 ships and over 200 crew members. By Veltari standards, such losses in a single engagement would be considered a defeat, regardless of the strategic outcome. Yet the humans were already making plans for the next battle, talking about modifications to their ships and new tactics to try. "Commander Velran," Zixthara said finally, "prepare a diplomatic envoy. I believe we need to learn more about these humans before we face the Devourers again." Velran's expression showed his disapproval. "They are emotional and unpredictable. Working with them will only introduce chaos into our operations." Zixthara watched the human ships moving among the wreckage, searching for survivors and salvaging what they could. One human vessel had stopped to rescue Veltari crew members from a damaged cruiser, even though the two species had been strangers hours before. "Perhaps," Zixthara said quietly, "but their chaos just saved 300,000 lives. We need to understand how that is possible." Zixthara stepped aboard the human flagship New Horizon 3 days after the first battle. The ship was smaller than any Veltari command vessel, and its corridors were filled with strange sounds. Humans laughed as they worked, called to each other across rooms, and played music from speakers mounted in the walls. It was chaos compared to the silent efficiency of Veltari ships. Admiral Kate Sullivan met Zixthara at the airlock. She was a small human woman with gray hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of many battles. She smiled when she saw Zixthara, which was confusing because smiling served no tactical purpose. "Welcome aboard," Admiral Sullivan said. "I hope you don't mind the noise. My crew works better when they're happy, and happy crews win more battles." Zixathera followed the Admiral through corridors filled with humans going about their duties. The ship was organized, but not in any way that made sense to Veltari military doctrine. Crew members of different ranks spoke freely to each other. Officers asked for opinions from enlisted personnel. Most strange of all, many of the crew had pictures of other humans attached to their workstations. "What are those images?" Zixathera asked, pointing to a photograph showing a human female with two smaller humans. "That's Petty Officer Johnson's family," Admiral Sullivan explained. "His wife Maria and their twin boys. Most of my crew keeps pictures of their loved ones nearby. It reminds them what they're fighting for." This made no sense to Zixathera. Veltari warriors focused only on the mission. Personal attachments were discouraged because they could compromise judgment. Yet the humans seemed to draw strength from thinking about people who were not even present. Admiral Sullivan led Zixathera to the ship's training deck, where human soldiers were practicing combat exercises. Staff Sergeant Tony Martinez was leading a group of Marines through scenarios that seemed designed to prepare them for fighting the Devourers. But the exercises were unlike anything in Veltari training manuals. "Okay, people," Martinez shouted. "The plan just went to hell, your communications are down, and the enemy is doing something completely unexpected. What do you do?" The Marines began moving in ways that looked random but somehow coordinated. They communicated with hand signals, voice calls, and sometimes just by looking at each other. When one Marine pretended to be wounded, two others immediately moved to help him, while the rest adjusted their positions to cover the rescue. "This is your idea of military training?" Zixathera asked Martinez after the exercise ended. Martinez grinned, which Zixathera had learned was a human expression of amusement. "Ma'am, with respect, we call it controlled chaos. See, the thing about plans is that they never survive contact with the enemy. So we train our people to think on their feet, adapt to changing situations, and never leave anyone behind." "But this introduces too many variables," Zixathera protested. "How can commanders maintain tactical control if individual soldiers are making independent decisions?" "That's the beauty of it," Martinez replied. "We don't try to control everything. We trust our people to do the right thing. Fear keeps you alive, but it also makes you fight harder for what matters." Zixathera spent the next several days observing human operations. The more they saw, the more confused they became. Humans made decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with tactical advantage. They took risks to save wounded comrades that would be considered wasteful by Veltari standards. They named their weapons, their ships, even their combat units after concepts like freedom, hope, and justice. The first joint training exercise was scheduled for the following week. Zixathera worked with Admiral Sullivan and her staff to plan an assault on a simulated Devourer facility. The Veltari contribution would be precise orbital bombardment, followed by organized ground forces advancing in standard formations. The humans would provide support and handle any unexpected developments. The exercise began according to plan. Veltari ships delivered accurate fire on predetermined targets, while ground forces advanced in perfect tactical formations. Everything proceeded exactly as the computer models predicted. Then the humans did what humans always seem to do. They changed everything. Major Ryan Cooper led the human ground forces, and he immediately deviated from the agreed-upon plan. Instead of following the Veltari advance, his troops split into smaller groups and began moving through areas that were supposed to be avoided. When Zixathera demanded an explanation, Cooper's response was typically human. "The simulation just threw us a curveball," he said over the radio. "There are supposed to be civilian prisoners in the lower levels. We can't just blast our way through if innocents might get hurt." "The simulation parameters did not include prisoners," Zixathera replied. "This is an unnecessary complication." "Maybe," Cooper said, "but we're going to check anyway. That's what humans do." The exercise quickly became chaotic. the human forces encountered simulated resistance that forced them to abandon their assigned objectives. Instead of retreating and regrouping as tactical, doctrine demanded, they began improvising new approaches. Some teams moved to rescue the simulated prisoners, while others created diversions to draw enemy attention. When the exercise computers simulated casualties among the human forces, Zixthara expected them to withdraw and reassess. Instead, humans did something that made no tactical sense. They refused to leave their wounded behind, even when doing so compromised the entire mission. Communications Officer Amy Foster volunteered to stay with the wounded while the rest of her unit completed their objectives. According to the simulation, her position was going to be overrun by enemy forces. She would almost certainly be killed, yet she calmly coordinated evacuation routes for the injured while preparing to face impossible odds alone. "This is tactically unsound," Zixthara told Admiral Sullivan. "She is sacrificing herself for soldiers who are already combat ineffective." Admiral Sullivan watched the exercise displays with an expression that Zixthara was beginning to recognize as pride. Amy Foster has 3 commendations for valor and a degree in xenobiology. She joined the military because she wanted to protect people. To her, those wounded soldiers aren't combat ineffective. They're her friends, her responsibility, her family. The exercise ended with technical victory for the combined forces, but the human casualties were enormous by Veltari standards. 40% of the human units had been eliminated or severely damaged. Any Veltari commander would face court-martial for such losses, yet the humans seemed satisfied with the results. "We saved the prisoners and completed the primary objectives," Major Cooper reported. "The casualty rate was within acceptable parameters for this type of operation." Zixthara studied the after-action reports late into the ship's night cycle. The mathematics were clear. Human tactics were inefficient, wasteful, and often counterproductive. Their emotional decision-making led to unnecessary risks and resource expenditure. By every measure that the Veltari used to evaluate military effectiveness, human forces should be inferior. Yet the humans had fought the Devourers to a standstill while Veltari forces had struggled. The humans had saved colony ships that Veltari doctrine would have written off as acceptable losses. They had accomplished objectives that seemed impossible through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. The next morning, Zixthara found Staff Sergeant Martinez in the ship's recreation area, looking at a small device that displayed moving pictures. The images showed a human female and a small human child playing in what appeared to be a garden. "Your family?" Zixthara asked. Martinez nodded. "My wife, Carmen, and our daughter, Sophia. They're back on Earth, safe in one of the core systems. Sophia just turned 6 last month. Does thinking about them not distract you from your duties?" Martinez looked at Zixthara with an expression that seemed sad and determined at the same time. "Just the opposite. Every time I go into battle, I know exactly what I'm fighting for. I'm not just following orders or serving some abstract concept of duty. I'm making sure that little girl gets to grow up in a universe where the monsters can't hurt her." Zixthara left the recreation area with more questions than answers. The humans fought not for conquest or glory, but for each other. They drew strength from their emotional connections rather than being weakened by them. They made tactical decisions based on values that had nothing to do with military efficiency, yet somehow their methods worked. As Zixthara walked through the corridors of the New Horizon, they began to notice details that had escaped attention before. Crew members asked about each other's families during shift changes. Officers made decisions that prioritized the safety of their subordinates over tactical advantage. The entire ship operated on principles that violated everything Zixthara had been taught about military command. Yet the ship was ready for battle, its crew was dedicated, and their morale was higher than anything Zixthara had seen in Veltari forces. The humans had found a way to turn emotion into strength, chaos into effectiveness, and love into a weapon more powerful than any plasma cannon. For the first time in 30 cycles of military service, Zixathara began to wonder if the Veltari way was the only way. The alert came at Aero 347 ship time, screaming through every communication channel on both fleets. Devourer constructs had emerged from hyperspace near New Terra, humanity's most important agricultural colony. The numbers were staggering. Over 200 construct ships, including several of the massive harvester vessels that could strip a planet bare in days. Zixathara rushed to the bridge of the New Horizon, where Admiral Sullivan was already coordinating the response. The tactical displays showed the grim reality. 3 million human civilians on New Terra, including families, children, and elderly colonists who had spent generations building their communities. The Devourer fleet was moving toward the planet with mechanical precision. "Strategic assessment," Admiral Sullivan called out to her staff. The response came from multiple officers simultaneously. "Colony evacuation impossible in available time frame. Enemy forces outnumber combined fleet assets by 4 to 1. Recommended action, withdraw to defensive positions around core systems." Zixathara felt a moment of relief. The humans were finally going to follow logical military doctrine. The colony was strategically unimportant compared to the industrial worlds of the inner systems. Sacrificing 3 million civilians was unfortunate, but preserving the fleet was essential for long-term survival. Admiral Sullivan studied the displays for exactly 30 seconds before making her decision. "Signal all ships. We're staying. Send word to New Terra that help is coming." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Zixathara stared at the Admiral in disbelief. "This is tactically impossible," they said. "The enemy forces are overwhelming. You will lose the entire fleet and accomplish nothing." "Maybe," Sullivan replied calmly. "But those are our people down there. Farmers who grow food for dozens of worlds. Families who left Earth to build something better. Children who've never seen war. We don't abandon our people." Communications from the Veltari fleet came through moments later. Commander Velran's voice was sharp with disapproval. "The strategic situation is untenable. Veltari forces are withdrawing to establish defensive positions at the Kepler Junction. We advise human forces to follow standard evacuation protocols." "Admiral," Sullivan took the communication herself. "Negative, Commander. We're making our stand here. If you want to help, we'd welcome the assistance. If not, we understand." The response was immediate. "This is illogical. You cannot save those civilians by sacrificing your fleet. The greater good requires strategic withdrawal." "The greater good," Sullivan said quietly, "is making sure that little kids get to wake up tomorrow in their own beds." Zixathara watched. The Veltari fleet began its withdrawal and felt something they had never experienced before: shame. The logical decision was clear, yet something about abandoning the humans felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. The first engagement began 6 hours later as Devourer advance scouts reached New Terra's outer system. The human fleet was pathetically outnumbered, but they fought with a desperation that defied mathematical prediction. Captain Ben Hayes led the first wave of defenders, his ship the Defiant ramming a Devourer construct twice its size to protect a group of evacuation transports. Zixathara found themselves in the ship's Combat Information Center, officially present, as an observer but increasingly involved in tactical planning. The humans asked for their input on Devourer weak points and accepted Veltari's strategic advice, even though they modified it to fit their own chaotic style of warfare. "Why are you staying?" Dr. Sarah Kim asked during a brief lull in the fighting. She was a civilian volunteer who had refused evacuation to help treat wounded soldiers. "Your people already left. You could have gone with them." Zixathara had been asking themselves the same question. By every measure of military logic, they should have departed with the Veltari fleet. Yet when the moment came to leave, they had remained aboard the New Horizon. "I am studying human tactics," Zixathara replied, though they knew it was not the complete truth. Dr. Kim smiled the way humans did when they understood something that had not been spoken aloud. Of course you are. The siege of New Terra lasted 17 days. The human fleet was slowly ground down by superior numbers, but they gave ground grudgingly and made the Devourers pay for every advance. More importantly, they bought time for civilian evacuations and for defensive preparations on the planet's surface. Zixthera went down to New Terra during the second week to observe ground operations. What they saw there changed everything they thought they knew about warfare. The planet's surface was a maze of improvised fortifications built by people who had never been soldiers. Farmers fought alongside their children to protect crop storage facilities. Teachers organized defensive positions around schools that had been converted into medical stations. An elderly human named Frank Miller had become the coordinator for civilian resistance in the northern continent. He was 73 years old, barely able to walk without assistance, yet he spent 18 hours a day organizing supply lines and coordinating with military units. When Zixthera asked why he did not evacuate with the other elderly civilians, his answer was simple. "This is my home," Frank said. "I planted trees here 40 years ago. My grandchildren learned to walk in these fields. You don't run away from home. You fight for it." The breaking point came on the 15th day. Devourer forces had broken through the outer defensive line and were advancing on the main civilian shelters. Lieutenant Danny Ross led a company of Marines in a desperate counterattack to buy evacuation time for a school shelter, containing over 800 children. Zixthera watched the battle from the command bunker, listening to radio communications as Ross's force was systematically destroyed by overwhelming enemy numbers. The logical decision was to withdraw and preserve what forces remained. Instead, Ross made a different choice. "Command, this is Lightning." "Six!" Ross's voice came over the radio, calm despite the chaos around him. "We're not falling back. These kids need 15 more minutes to reach the transport zone. We can give them 15 minutes. "Danny, you need to pull back now," came the reply from his commanding officer. "You can't hold that position." "Negative, sir. We're exactly where we need to be." Zixthera listened as Ross's force was reduced from 40 Marines to 20, then to 10, then to 5. Throughout the battle, Ross continued coordinating the defense, calling out enemy positions and directing the last transports to safety. His final transmission was to his mother back on Earth. "Tell Mom I kept my promise," he said. "Tell her I never ran away from the important stuff." The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of Devourer constructs moving through the abandoned positions. 800 children reached the transport zone safely. Lieutenant Daniel Ross was 23 years old. That night, Zixthera sat in their assigned quarters and tried to understand what they had witnessed. By Veltari standards, Ross had wasted his life and the lives of his soldiers for no strategic gain. The children he saved would likely die anyway when the planet fell. His sacrifice accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable. Yet Zixthera found themselves thinking about the 800 children who had lived through another day because of Ross's decision. They thought about the man's mother, who had learned that her son had died protecting innocents. They thought about the promise Ross had made, probably as a child, to never run away from what mattered. For the first time in their life, Zixthera felt something the Veltari had no word for, the overwhelming need to protect others at any cost. It was illogical, inefficient, and tactically unsound. It was also the most important thing in the universe. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A Veltari relief fleet was approaching New Terra, led by Commander Velron himself. The message was brief and formal. Reconsidered strategic assessment, preparing to assist in defensive operations. Zixthera met Velron at the landing platform where his shuttle touched down. The commander's expression was carefully neutral, but Zixthera knew him well enough to see the uncertainty beneath. "What changed your mind?" Zixthera asked. Velron was quiet for a long moment, watching human soldiers helping evacuated civilians board transport ships. "The Hegemony Council received reports of our withdrawal from New Terra," he said finally. "The reaction was not what we expected. Many questioned whether we had acted with honor." Honor? A human concept that our translators struggle with, Velron admitted. "But perhaps one we need to understand better. These humans are willing to die for people they have never met, for ideals they cannot touch, for a future they may not live to see. There is power in such dedication." Zix-Athara looked at their old commander and realized that the humans had changed him too. The rigid certainty that had always characterized Velran was gone, replaced by something more complex and harder to define. "What are your orders?" Zix-Athara asked. "To learn," Velran replied. "To fight alongside these humans and discover what makes them so formidable, and perhaps to find out what we have been missing in our pursuit of perfect tactical efficiency." The final battle for New Terra began at dawn on the 18th day of the siege. Devourer harvester ships descended through the planet's atmosphere like metallic storms, their massive hulls blocking out the sun as they moved toward population centers. From orbit, the combined human and Veltari fleets prepared for what everyone knew would be their last stand. Zix-Athara stood at the tactical station on the New Horizons bridge, wearing a human combat uniform that had been modified for their physiology. 3 weeks of fighting alongside humans had changed them in ways that went deeper than clothing. They found themselves thinking about individual soldiers by name rather than as tactical units. They worried about civilian casualties in ways that served no strategic purpose. Most disturbing of all, they had begun to understand what humans meant when they talked about fear. Admiral Sullivan called the final briefing at Oro 600 hours. Representatives from both fleets gathered in the New Horizons main conference room, their faces showing the strain of weeks of constant battle. The tactical situation was hopeless by any reasonable measure. The Devourer fleet still outnumbered them 3-1, and the harvester ships were already beginning to strip resources from New Terra's surface. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored allies," Sullivan began, "we all know the numbers. We're outgunned, outnumbered, and out of time. But we've got something they don't understand. We're fighting for our home." Commander Velran spoke for the Veltari forces. His words were carefully chosen, balancing military protocol with concepts his people were still learning to comprehend. "The Veltari fleet will coordinate with human forces in whatever capacity serves the mission. We have observed that human tactical methods, while unconventional, possess effectiveness that our models cannot adequately predict." The plan that emerged from the briefing was a combination of Veltari precision and human improvisation. The Veltari ships would engage the primary Devourer fleet in a traditional battle line, using their superior firepower to draw attention away from the planet. Meanwhile, human forces would attempt a series of surgical strikes against the Harvester ships, using their smaller, more maneuverable vessels to exploit weaknesses in Devourer defensive arrays. It was a desperate gambit that depended on perfect timing and more luck than any military commander should rely on. It was also the only chance they had. The battle began with a massive exchange of fire between the main fleets. Veltari plasma. Cannons traded shots with Devourer energy weapons in a display of raw, destructive power that lit up the void between the stars. The mathematical precision of Veltari targeting systems, matched against the brutal efficiency of ancient war machines, created a spectacle that was both beautiful and terrible. But Zix-Athara's attention was focused on the human strike teams diving toward the planet's surface. Captain Morrison led one group of fighters in an attack on a harvester ship that was stripping mineral resources from the northern continent. His pilots flew through defensive fire that should have destroyed them instantly, yet somehow they weaved between energy beams and missile barrages with an intuition that defied explanation. "How do they do that?" Commander Velron asked, watching the tactical displays with fascination and bewilderment. "They stop thinking," Zix-Athara replied, surprising themselves with the answer. "They trust their instincts, and react to threats before their conscious minds can process the information. It should not work, but it does. The human assault on the Harvester ships was coordinated chaos. Pilots like Lisa Park's replacement, Lieutenant Amy Carter, flew attack patterns that looked random but somehow managed to find gaps in Devourer defensive systems. Ground forces led by surviving Marines from Lieutenant Ross's unit moved through the Harvester landing zones with a combination of tactical knowledge and pure determination. But the cost was enormous. Human ships exploded in brilliant flashes as they pressed attacks that no sane pilot would attempt. Ground teams vanished into the mechanical mazes of Harvester ships, knowing they would likely never return. The casualty reports streaming into the command center would have been cause for immediate retreat under any conventional military doctrine. The humans kept fighting. Zixathera watched Sergeant Carol Wright coordinate a ground assault on a Harvester ship's power core. Her team had been reduced from 20 Marines to 6, and she herself was wounded from shrapnel that had torn through her armor. According to military logic, she should withdraw her remaining forces and await reinforcement. Instead, she led her team deeper into the Harvester ship, calling out enemy positions while carrying a wounded comrade on her back. "Command, this is Ground Team 7?" Wright's voice came over the radio, steady despite the sounds of weapons fire around her. "We've located the primary power coupling. Initiating demolition sequence." "Negative, Ground 7, came the reply from the tactical center. "Your exit route has been compromised. Abort the mission and withdraw." "Can't do that, sir," Wright replied. "This Harvester is heading for the school district. My daughter goes to school in that district." Zixathera felt something twist in their chest, an emotion they had no name for. Wright was going to die to save children she might never meet, simply because one of them happened to be her own. It was mathematically insignificant, tactically irrelevant, and strategically pointless. It was also the most important thing happening in the entire battle. The Harvester ship's power core exploded in a chain reaction that brought down the massive vessel and saved 40,000 civilians in the surrounding area. Sergeant Carol Wright and her team were listed as missing in action, presumed dead. As the battle raged on, Zixathera began to see a pattern that had escaped their notice before. The humans were not just fighting to win, they were fighting to save specific people, to protect particular places, to preserve individual moments of life that had meaning beyond any strategic calculation. Every human soldier knew exactly what they were fighting for, and that knowledge gave them strength that no amount of training or equipment could provide. The tide of battle began to turn when the Veltari fleet adopted human tactics. "Commander, Velran ordered his ships to break formation and engage in the kind of chaotic, unpredictable combat that humans seem to thrive on." Veltari pilots, trained for precision and order, found themselves improvising attack runs and responding to situations with something approaching intuition. It should not have worked. Veltari military doctrine had been perfected over centuries of warfare, tested against dozens of enemy species and proven effective in countless engagements. Yet when Veltari ships began fighting like humans, their effectiveness increased dramatically. The breakthrough came when a combined human Veltari strike team managed to board and destroy the lead Devourer command ship. The team was led by Major Cooper and included Zixathera, who had volunteered for the mission despite having no official combat role. Working together, human improvisation and Veltari technical knowledge proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had been designed to counter traditional military tactics. Zixathera found themselves fighting alongside humans in the cramped corridors of the Devourer ship, using weapons they had barely trained with to protect soldiers they had come to consider friends. When Private Johnson was wounded by Devourer defensive systems, Zixathera did not hesitate to help carry him to safety, even though doing so exposed them to enemy fire and served no tactical purpose. "Why?" Johnson asked weakly, as Zixathera dragged him toward the extraction point. "Why risk yourself for me?" Zixathera realized they did not have a logical answer. By Veltari standards, Johnson was a replaceable tactical asset whose loss would have minimal impact on overall mission effectiveness. Yet the thought of leaving him behind was impossible to accept. "Because you are not just a soldier," Zixthera said, surprising themselves with the honesty of the response. "You are Private Johnson, who shows pictures of his twin boys to anyone who will look. You are the person who shared his rations when I was unfamiliar with human food. You matter." The destruction of the command ship sent cascading failures through the entire Devourer fleet. Without centralized coordination, the ancient machines began making tactical errors that allowed the combined human Veltari forces to exploit weaknesses in their formations. One by one, the massive constructs were destroyed or disabled, their mechanical perfection no match for the chaotic determination of beings who fought for reasons beyond logic. But victory came at a price that would haunt Zixthera forever. The final casualty reports showed losses that would have broken any conventional military force. Admiral Sullivan was among the dead, killed when her ship rammed a Devourer harvester to prevent it from reaching a refugee convoy. Over half the human fleet had been destroyed, and thousands of ground personnel were missing or confirmed dead. By Veltari standards, the Battle of New Terra should have been recorded as a Pyrrhic victory, a tactical success achieved at such cost that it constituted a strategic defeat. The human response was completely different. Captain Morrison, now promoted to admiral after Sullivan's death, addressed both fleets from the bridge of his damaged ship. His words were broadcast to every vessel and every surviving ground unit, and they revealed something about humanity that Zixthera was only beginning to understand. 3 months after the Battle of New Terra, Zixthera walked through the rebuilt streets of the colony's main city. The scars of war were still visible in damaged buildings and memorial walls covered with names of the fallen, but life had returned with a resilience that continued to amaze them. Children played in parks that had been battlefields, farmers tended crops in soil that had been scorched by energy weapons, and families gathered in homes that had been rebuilt from rubble. The Devourer threat was over, at least for now. The destruction of their command fleet had sent the remaining constructs into dormancy, returning them to the dark spaces between stars where they would wait for some future awakening. The combined human Veltari fleet maintained patrols throughout the sector, but the immediate crisis had passed. Zixthera's official role was now fleet liaison, a position created specifically to maintain cooperation between the two species. It was important work that served clear strategic purposes, but it was not the real reason they had chosen to remain with the human fleet instead of returning to Veltari space. The real reason was harder to explain, even to themselves. Something had changed during those weeks of fighting alongside humans, something that made it impossible to return to the rigid certainties of Veltari military doctrine. They had learned things that could not be unlearned, felt emotions that could not be forgotten, and seen possibilities that could not be ignored. Admiral Morrison found them at the memorial wall where Lieutenant Ross's name was engraved alongside hundreds of others. The young admiral had aged years in the months since his promotion, the weight of command and loss etched in lines around his eyes. But he still smiled when he saw Zixthera, the same warm expression that had puzzled them during their first meeting. "I got word from the Hegemony Council," Morrison said. "They want to meet with you when you're ready to return home." Zixthera traced Ross's name with one finger, remembering the young officer's final radio transmission. "What would I tell them?" they asked. "How could I explain what I have learned here?" "That's a fair question," Morrison admitted. "What have you learned?" Zixthera was quiet for a long moment, watching children play in the square where Devourer constructs had once landed. "I learned that strength and weakness are not what we thought they were," they said finally. "The Veltari believe that emotion makes soldiers unreliable, that fear clouds judgment, that love creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. But humans have shown me something different." A group of school children ran past them, laughing as they chased each other through the memorial garden. One of them was Kate Park, daughter of the pilot who had sacrificed herself in the first battle. The child was healthy and happy, completely unaware that her existence had been purchased with her mother's life. Fear is not the opposite of courage, Zixathara continued. It is the foundation of courage. Humans do not fight because they are unafraid. They fight because they are terrified of losing what matters to them. That fear makes them stronger, not weaker. Morrison nodded slowly. What else? Love is not a tactical weakness, Zixathara said. It is the most powerful weapon in the universe. When Sergeant Wright died to save the school district, she was not making a strategic error. She was demonstrating the kind of strength that no amount of technology or training can create. She fought not for abstract concepts like duty or honor, but for specific people she cared about. That gave her power that the Devourers could not understand or counter. They walked together through the city, past shops and homes and schools, that testified to humanity's refusal to surrender their future to fear. Everywhere they looked, Zixathara saw evidence of the strength they had discovered during the battle. People working together, families supporting each other, communities rebuilding not just structures, but dreams. The Veltari have spent centuries perfecting the art of war, Zixathara said as they reached the spaceport where both human and Veltari ships stood ready for patrol duties. We created fleets that could conquer star systems and tactics that could defeat any conventional enemy. But we forgot something essential. We forgot why wars are fought in the first place. And why are they fought? Morrison asked. To protect what we love, Zixathara replied without hesitation. Everything else is just methodology. At the spaceport, they were met by Commander Velron, who had arrived that morning with a small diplomatic contingent from the hegemony. The Veltari commander had changed during his time with the human fleet, becoming less rigid in his thinking and more willing to consider alternatives to traditional doctrine. The Council is eager for your report, Velron told Zixathara. They want to understand how human tactics proved so effective against the Devourers. It was not their tactics, Zixathara said. It was their motivation. Humans fight for each other in ways that transcend tactical considerations. They make decisions based on principles that have nothing to do with strategic advantage, yet those decisions often prove strategically superior to our calculated approaches. Velran looked uncomfortable with this assessment. The Council will expect concrete recommendations for improving Veltari military effectiveness. Then I will give them one, Zixathara said firmly. We must learn to fight for something beyond conquest and glory. We must find reasons to risk everything that go deeper than duty and hierarchy. We must discover what it means to care about others more than we care about ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by alarms sounding across the spaceport. A new threat had been detected at the edge of the system. Not Devourers this time, but a refugee convoy fleeing from some unknown disaster in the outer sectors. The ships were badly damaged and would need immediate assistance to reach safe harbor. Admiral Morrison was already moving toward his command shuttle. All available ships prepare for rescue operations, he ordered. Looks like we've got people in trouble. Zixathara watched the immediate response from both human and Veltari crews. There was no debate about whether the refugees deserved help, no calculation of costs versus benefits, no consideration of whether assisting strangers served any strategic purpose. The need was clear, and that was enough. Within minutes, medical ships were launching to provide aid. Escort vessels were moving. To protect the convoy and supply transports were loading relief materials. It was exactly the kind of response that would have puzzled Zixathara months earlier. A massive commitment of resources to help people who could offer nothing in return. Now they understood that this was not weakness or inefficiency. It was the source of humanity's greatest strength. I will not be returning to Veltari space, Zixathara told Commander Velron as rescue ships disappeared into hyperspace. My place is here, learning from humans and helping to build something better than either of our species could create alone. Velron studied them for a long moment. The Council will not understand your decision. Then perhaps it is time for the council to send more observers, Zixthera suggested. Perhaps it is time for all Veltari to learn what I have learned. As the refugee convoy approached New Terra's orbital facilities, Zixthera stood on the observation deck of the New Horizon and prepared for another crisis, another test of the principles they had discovered during the war against the Devourers. There would be injured to heal, displaced families to shelter, and damaged ships to repair. It would be chaotic, inefficient, and expensive. It would also be exactly what needed to be done. The rescued refugees turned out to be survivors of a devourer, attack on a distant colony, people who had lost everything but their lives and their hope for a better future. As they were brought aboard the station, Zixthera watched human and Veltari personnel working together to provide aid without expectation of reward or consideration of cost. In that moment, surrounded by beings who chose compassion over calculation and love over logic, Zixthera finally understood what fear truly was. It was not the terror of death or defeat. It was the terror of living in a universe where such moments of grace were impossible, where beings cared only for themselves and fought only for personal gain. Humans had shown them a different universe, one where people would die for strangers and sacrifice everything for ideals they could not touch. It was a universe worth fighting for, worth dying for, and worth living for. When the joint memorial service was held that evening for all those lost in recent battles, Zixthera took their place among beings from two species who had learned to see past their differences to the common hopes that united them. As names were read and stories were shared, they realized that the war against the Devourers had ended with more than military victory. It had ended with the birth of something new, a partnership based not on strategic convenience, but on genuine understanding, a friendship forged in battle and strengthened by shared sacrifice, and a vision of the future where different species could work together to protect what mattered most. The memorial service ended with a moment of silence for the fallen, followed by a promise spoken by every person present, that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that their example would not be wasted, and that the universe they had died to protect would be worthy of their gift.